I told my daughter-in-law over $340,000 last year, quietly, from what was left of my pension after Grace died. I never told my son. At his funeral, standing over his casket in the same suit I wore to his wedding, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear and said, "This house isn't big enough for both of us anymore, Roger. You have 2 weeks." The next morning, a bank examiner was standing on her porch with a folder full of my son's handwriting. My name is Roger Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, and before I tell you what happened on that porch, you need to understand exactly how much I gave away to protect a woman who was never planning to let me keep anything at all. I bought my house on Larkspur Court in Asheville, North Carolina in 1991. I was 29, working as a machinist at the furniture plant outside town, and my wife Grace was 7 months pregnant with our son Michael. We didn't have much back then: a used pickup truck, a mortgage that scared me half to death, and a little brick house with a crooked mailbox that I straightened every spring without ever quite fixing it for good. Grace hung curtains. She sewed herself. I laid the flagstone path to the front door one weekend at a time over 2 summers, my knees aching for a week after each session. We raised Michael in that house. We watched him ride a bike down that crooked driveway, watched him leave for community college, watched him come home 4 years later with an associate's degree in HVAC repair and a work ethic that made me prouder than any diploma could have. Grace passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late, gone within 8 months of the first appointment. After that, it was just me in that house, rattling around in rooms that used to be full of noise. Michael worried about me. He'd call every Sunday, sometimes drive over just to sit on the porch and not say much, because some silences you don't need to fill. So when he told me he was marrying a woman named Renee Castellano, and that they wanted to move in with me, help take care of the place, help take care of me, I said yes, before he finished the sentence. I thought it was exactly what Grace would have wanted. I thought my son had found someone who loved him enough to build a life around him. I did not know then that Renee had already done the math on what that house, that land, and my savings account were worth, and that my son moving back in was simply the fastest way for her to get close enough to all three. I can see the early signs now, looking back, the way you can only see a riptide once you're already caught in it. Within the first year, Renee had convinced Michael that Grace's old sewing room, the one with the window that caught the morning light just right, needed to become her home gym. I let it go. She started referring to our house within 18 months, even though the deed had my name on it and only mine. I let that go too. Michael worked long shifts installing HVAC systems, coming home exhausted, and every night I watched him get a little quieter at the dinner table, a little more careful about what he said and when he said it. He used to whistle old Merle Haggard songs while he worked in the garage. By the second year, I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard him whistle at all. I noticed how Renee asked, more than once, in that light and breezy way people use when they're testing how far they can push, whether I'd ever thought about putting Michael on the deed, just in case something happened. I noticed how she'd walk through the house sometimes like she was pricing furniture at an estate sale that hadn't happened yet. I told myself I was a suspicious old man who'd read too many news stories. I told myself my son was happy, and that his happiness was worth more than my discomfort. I was wrong to stay quiet as long as I did, but I loved that boy more than I trusted my own gut, and at the time, that felt like the right kind of sacrifice to make. About 5 months before everything changed, Michael asked me to meet him for coffee at a diner off Tunnel Road, away from the house, just the two of us. He looked thinner than usual, and there was a stillness in him I hadn't seen since his mother's diagnosis. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table and told me to put it somewhere Renee would never think to look. I asked him what was in it. He said, "Dad, I need you to trust me on this. If anything ever happens to me, you open this before you do anything else, before you talk to anybody, before you sign anything." I laughed it off a little, told him he was being dramatic for a 34-year-old man in good health. He didn't laugh. He just held my eyes in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up, something between fear and resolve, like he'd already made peace with a decision I hadn't been told about yet. I took the envelope without opening it and locked it in the fireproof lockbox. Grace and I had bought 30 years ago to hold our marriage license and Michael's birth certificate. I didn't push him for more. He looked like a man who'd already spent every ounce of courage he had just handing it over. That envelope sat in the bottom of my closet for 5 months. I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had left in this world. It was a Thursday night in March when the phone rang. Michael had been driving home from a job site out past Black Mountain and a tractor trailer had crossed the center line on a stretch of two-lane highway in the rain. The state trooper on the phone used the words instantaneous and did not suffer, and I remember standing in my kitchen holding onto the counter because my legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold me up. Renee was in the next room when the call came through, and I remember her face going white, her hand flying to her mouth, and for one brief human moment, I saw something in her that looked like real grief. And it made that terrible night feel a little less like I was standing in it alone. I would later understand that grief and panic can look identical on a face that's calculating what it stands to lose. The days after are mostly fog now. Funeral home visits, choosing a casket the color of dark cherry wood because it reminded me of the kitchen table I'd built him as a boy. Phone calls to cousins in Tennessee and Georgia. Renee handled the flowers, the obituary, the caterer for the reception, and at the time I was grateful because I could barely remember to eat. I kept expecting to hear his truck in the driveway around 6. I kept almost setting 3 places at the table before I caught myself and put the extra plate away. Losing Grace had nearly broken me. Losing Michael felt like losing the last living piece of everything Grace and I had spent our whole lives building. I sat in his old bedroom one night, in the race car bed frame I never had the heart to take apart even after he grew too tall for it, and I cried until there was nothing left in me to cry with. I had no idea that inside of a week, the woman helping me choose flower arrangements for my son's funeral would stand in my own living room on the day we buried him and tell me to get out of the house I'd built with my own hands. The service was held on a gray, drizzling Saturday at Grace Community Baptist, the same church where Michael had been baptized 34 years earlier. Close to 90 people came co-workers from the HVAC company, high school friends who drove in from 3 states, neighbors who'd watched him grow up on that street. I stood near the casket for 2 hours, shaking hands, accepting more hugs than I could count, my throat too tight to say much of anything back. Renee stood beside me the entire time in black, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that never seemed to actually get wet. After the burial, everyone came back to the house for the reception, same as we'd done for Grace 6 years before. I was sitting in my recliner in the corner of the living room, still in my funeral suit, a paper plate of food someone had handed me going cold and untouched on my knee, when Renee crossed the room and crouched down beside my chair. The living room was full, 20, maybe 25 people, standing in small clusters with coffee cups and low conversation. She leaned in close, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearest cluster of guests, and said, "This house isn't big enough for both of us anymore, Roger. It's time you thought about somewhere smaller. You have 2 weeks." The room did not go fully silent. Not at first. A few conversations kept going a beat too long before people realized what they'd just heard. I saw my neighbor of 22 years, a retired firefighter named Ellis Duncan, stop mid-sip of his coffee, his eyes cutting sideways toward me. I saw Michael's supervisor, a woman named Carla, go rigid where she stood by the fireplace. Every person close enough heard it on the day we buried my only child, in the house I had poured 2 summers of my life into building the front walk for. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue with her in front of all those people who'd just watched us lower my son into the ground. I looked at Renee for a long moment, and something in me went very still, the way a pond goes still and hard right before the first frost sets in. I thought about that envelope locked in my closet. I thought about the 5 months I'd spent trusting my son's judgment without asking a single question I probably should have asked. I thought about 34 years of birthdays and Christmases and a flagstone path laid one aching Saturday at a time. Then I looked at her, and I said, "Understood." Just that. One word. The room stayed uneasy for a few seconds longer before conversations slowly, carefully started back up. Nobody quite sure what they'd just watched happen to a grieving man on the worst day of his life. I stood, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and packed one duffel bag. I didn't need much. A few changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, a photograph of Grace and Michael from a 4th of July cookout years back, and the fireproof lockbox with my son's envelope still sealed inside it. I came back downstairs 15 minutes later, bag over one shoulder, lockbox tucked under my arm, and walked past Renee toward the front door without another word. She looked almost let down that I wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't giving her the scene she seemed to have been expecting. I gave her nothing. I opened my own front door, stepped out into the cold March drizzle, and walked 3 houses down the street without turning around once. Behind me, I could hear the low, confused murmur of my son's own funeral guests, wondering exactly what they'd just watched a widower of father get told in his own living room. Ellis Duncan had lived 3 doors down for over 20 years, ever since he and his wife Marion moved on to Larkspur Court back in the early 2000s. He was 71 now, a retired fire captain, the kind of man who still climbed his own ladder to clean his gutters every October, no matter how many times his daughter told him to stop. He'd been at the funeral. He'd heard exactly what Renee said. When he opened his front door and saw me standing on his porch with a duffel bag and a metal lockbox, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped back and said, "Get on in here, Roger, before you catch your death out there." Marion had the guest room made up before I'd even finished my coffee. I sat at their kitchen table while Ellis poured 2 mugs and slid one across to me. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. So I told him everything, the 2-week deadline, the way she'd said it loud enough for half the room to hear, the strange, cold satisfaction on her face, like she'd been waiting for the right audience to say it in front of. Ellis shook his head slow, his jaw working. "That house is yours, Roger," he said. "Deed's always been in your name. Has been since before Michael was born. She's got no more right to that house than I do." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that lockbox sitting by my chair, on the envelope Michael had told me to open first, before anything else, if the worst ever happened. That night, once Ellis and Marion had gone up to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small reading lamp and finally broke the seal. Inside were 4 things that changed everything I thought I understood about the last 5 months of my son's life. The first was a copy of my house deed, confirming exactly what Ellis had already told me: the property had always been solely in my name, never transferred to Michael or Renee in any form. The second was a printed statement from a joint checking account Michael and Renee had shared. With red circles, Michael had drawn himself around 11 separate cash withdrawals, totaling almost $61,000 over 14 months. Each one made on days Michael's own work schedule showed him on a job site, nowhere near a bank. The third was a printout of a second mortgage application, one Renee had apparently begun filling out using my address, my property, and a signature on the co-borrower line that was not remotely close to my actual handwriting. The fourth was a letter, handwritten, in Michael's careful block print, the same handwriting he'd used on birthday cards for 30 years. In it, he explained that he'd discovered the missing money about 8 months into their marriage, hidden inside what he thought was a joint savings goal for a house down payment. He wrote that he'd hired a private investigator, quietly, using money from his own separate account. After he found out the withdrawals matched dates Renee had told him she was visiting her sister in Charlotte, dates the investigator confirmed she had. Instead, spent at a casino resort 2 hours outside the city with a man named Victor Aldana, someone Michael had never heard of before that report landed in his inbox. He wrote that he suspected she was building toward pushing me out of the house so she could refinance it and drain whatever equity remained, using me as collateral without my knowledge or consent. He asked me to forgive him for not telling me sooner, said he hadn't wanted to break my heart with a marriage falling apart until he had enough proof to actually do something about it. And he asked me, begged me, really in the last lines, to protect myself, no matter what it looked like from the outside, no matter how it might look to people at church. I read that letter 3 times at that kitchen table, tears running steady down my face. Grief tangled up now with something sharper and colder settling into my chest. My son had known. My son had spent what turned out to be the final months of his life quietly building a case to protect his father from a woman who had already decided our family's grief would be nothing more than an opportunity the day it finally arrived. I folded the letter back along its worn creases, placed everything back in the lockbox, and for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like a man standing helpless in the wreckage of his own life. The next morning, while I sat eating eggs at Ellis and Marion's table, Renee was already moving fast back at my house. A neighbor across the street, a woman named Patsy, who'd lived on Larkspur Court almost as long as I had, called Marion's phone around 9:30 to say she'd seen a man in a gray suit going door to door with a clipboard and a folder, asking questions about recent activity at my address. Patsy assumed he was another real estate agent, like the one Renee had already had out twice that week, measuring rooms with a laser tool. What Patsy didn't know, and what I didn't know yet either, was that this man wasn't from a real estate office at all. I called Dolores Whitcomb that same morning, an old family friend and Grace's second cousin, who'd spent almost 25 years as an attorney, specializing in property and fraud cases in Buncombe County. She'd handled our will years earlier, and had known Michael since he was in diapers. I told her everything: the funeral, the 2-week deadline, the envelope, the second mortgage application with a forged signature. Dolores went quiet on the line for a long moment, then told me to sit tight, that she needed to make a few calls. 2 hours later, she called back with news that made the floor feel unsteady beneath me all over again. She'd already had a contact reach out to First Highland Savings and Loan that morning, and it turned out I wasn't the only one who'd noticed something wrong. A junior loan officer named Priya Anand had flagged the second mortgage application 3 days earlier, before Michael had even been buried. Because the co-borrower's signature on file didn't match a single sample of my actual signature the bank had on record from a home equity line I'd taken out for a roof replacement 11 years ago, Priya had escalated it to the bank's internal fraud examiner, a methodical man named Gary Osei, who had spent the better part of that week quietly building a file before ever setting foot on Larkspur Court. The man Patsy saw with the clipboard hadn't been a real estate agent at all. He'd been Gary, canvassing the neighborhood, asking careful, low-key questions to establish a timeline before the bank moved forward with anything official. Dolores explained to me, slowly and clearly, exactly how the fraud had worked. Renee had never needed Michael to sign anything transferring the deed, because the deed was never going to change hands at all, not directly. Instead, she'd used my property as collateral on a second mortgage application, forging what looked like my consent as a cosigner, with the loan proceeds structured to route through a joint account she and Michael had shared, an account she still had access to as the surviving spouse. If the loan had gone through before the fraud was caught, she would have walked away with roughly $180,000 in cash within days, secured against a house she had no legal claim to whatsoever, while I would have been left facing a lien on my own property that I never agreed to and never signed for. Gary Osei had already pulled the notary records tied to the mortgage application, and just like Dolores suspected, the notarization was fraudulent. The notary listed, a woman named Colleen Traver, turned out to be someone Renee had known from her previous job at a payday loan office, and Colleen had no record whatsoever of notarizing anything for a Roger Whitfield on the date listed or on any date that year. Dolores told me this wasn't simply a family dispute I could quietly walk away from anymore. This was mortgage fraud and forgery, both serious felonies under North Carolina law, and both carried real prison time if proven. She asked me one plain question before going any further. Roger, do you want to try to handle this quietly? Keep it inside the family? Or do you want it reported? All of it. Exactly as it happened. I thought about Michael, about that careful block handwriting, about the months he must have spent gathering proof while still coming home every night and sitting across from her at dinner, protecting me from a truth he wasn't ready to hand me yet. I thought about Renee crouched beside my recliner on the day we buried him, telling me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere smaller. I looked at Dolores and said, report every piece of it. Dolores filed a formal complaint with the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office that same afternoon, attaching the forged cosigner signature, the false notarization, the bank's own fraud examiner's findings, and Michael's handwritten letter as supporting documentation. By that evening, the case had already been referred to the Asheville Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. The detective assigned was a woman named Detective Renata Colson, 16 years on the force. The last 9 spent almost entirely on fraud and forgery cases. Dolores met with her personally that night and walked her through the full timeline: Michael's death, the funeral, the 2-week eviction demand delivered in front of dozens of witnesses, and a fraudulent mortgage application filed while his body was still at the funeral home. Detective Colson pulled Michael's actual employment records that same night, confirming through GPS-logged service calls exactly where he'd been on every date listed in the letter, nowhere near a bank, nowhere near a notary's office, exactly as his own handwritten notes had claimed. She reached out to the private investigator Michael had hired, a retired state trooper named Walt Ferris, who still had the full case file, complete with photographs and receipts, confirming the casino trips with Victor Aldana on the very days Renee had claimed to be visiting her sister. Detective Colson also contacted the loan officer, Priya Anand, who was more than willing to cooperate fully, having already flagged the file herself before any of us even knew what was happening. Detective Colson told Dolores that between the forged notarization, the mismatched signature, the private investigator's documented timeline, and Michael's own handwritten account, she had more than enough for a warrant. She also mentioned that Renee had attempted to file an early claim on Michael's small workplace life insurance policy that same week, a modest $75. 000 payout, not realizing that Michael had quietly changed the beneficiary to me 4 months earlier, the same week he'd handed me that envelope at the diner. That attempted claim, filed while the mortgage fraud investigation was already underway, only added another thread, pulling everything tighter around her. 6 days after the funeral, exactly as Detective Colson had planned, an unmarked sedan pulled into the driveway of my house on Larkspur Court at 8:15 in the morning. Patsy told Marion afterward that Renee answered the door in a bathrobe, her hair still wet from the shower, clearly not expecting company. Detective Colson identified herself and informed Renee she was investigating a formal complaint of mortgage fraud and forgery connected to the property, and that she had a number of questions regarding a document filed with First Highland Savings and Loan that same week. According to Patsy, who was out watering her hydrangeas at the time and had a clean view of the whole porch, Renee's face went the color of drywall standing in that doorway. She tried to explain that the loan was meant to help cover funeral costs, that she'd been overwhelmed with grief and hadn't been thinking clearly. But Detective Colson calmly informed her that the bank's own signature verification, combined with the notary's sworn statement that she'd never notarized the document at all, told a very different story. Renee was brought in for formal questioning that same morning, along with Colleen Traver, the notary who'd allowed her stamp and seal to be used without ever actually performing the notarization. Within 9 days, both women were formally charged: Renee with mortgage fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud, and Colleen with forgery and notary misconduct. The fraudulent loan application was voided by the bank the moment the investigation confirmed the forged signature, and because the loan had never actually funded, no lien was ever placed on my property. Dolores told me that had it gone through even 2 days sooner, before Priya Anand's sharp eyes caught the mismatch, I could have spent years fighting to clear my own home's title. Renee was given 10 days by the estate's temporary administrator to remove her belongings from the house, the same house where she'd once given me 2 weeks to disappear less than 3 weeks earlier. Ellis told me later that when the moving van finally came for her things, not a single neighbor on Larkspur Court came out to help her carry a single box. Patsy stood on her own porch the whole time, arms crossed, making sure nothing that wasn't hers left in those boxes, along with everything that was. I moved back into my house on a cool Tuesday morning in April, almost exactly 1 month to the day after I'd walked out with a duffel bag and a lockbox under my arm. Ellis and Marion helped me carry a few things back inside, and Patsy brought over a pound cake that evening, the kind of small, unasked-for kindness this street has always run on. The house felt different without Michael in it, and some part of it always will. But it also finally felt like mine again, all the way through, the way it had always been meant to feel. I found Grace's old sewing machine still shoved in the corner of what had briefly become Renee's home gym, dust cover intact, untouched for 2 years. I moved it back into the little room with the good morning light, right where it belonged, and I sat with it a long while before I ever pulled the cover off again. Renee eventually took a plea deal on the fraud and forgery charges, avoiding the maximum sentence but still receiving 18 months of active probation, a felony record that will follow her the rest of her life, and a court order to repay the bank's investigation costs, along with Michael's estate's legal fees. She never once tried to contact me after that morning on the porch, and I never reached out to her either. There was nothing left between us worth saying. Some evenings I still sit in that same recliner in the corner of the living room, the same chair I was sitting in the day she crouched down beside me and told me I had 2 weeks, and I think about my son. I think about how, even while he was quietly falling apart inside a marriage built on a lie, even while he was carrying fears he never let show on his face at our Sunday dinners, Michael found a way to protect his father one last time before he ever knew for certain he'd need to. That envelope wasn't just paperwork sitting in a closet for 5 months. It was the last thing my son ever gave me, and it turned out to be the thing that saved everything Grace and I had spent our whole lives building. I lost my only child, and there isn't a single day that fills that particular hole back in. But I got to keep the house we raised him in. And more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who my son was, right up until the very last months of his life, when he was still, in his own quiet way, taking care of his old man,